As Josh said, I'm from Brazil, from central Brazil, not from the well-known areas like São Paulo or Rio. And just to answer a question that people in general ask me, no, I'm not related to the famous anthropologist in Brazil, Darcy Ribeiro. It's just a very common last name in Portuguese, although there is a remote possibility of relationship because he's also from the state where my father comes from, and also because the very first criminal that the Portuguese left behind to learn the language of the Indians was a guy named Ribeiro. So maybe we all descend from that first guy. So I like to claim that I am from a long line of linguists working with indigenous language since 1500, you know. So I'll be talking about Macro-G, which is a very large grouping of languages in South America. Not as well known as other families as Carib, Arawak, or Tupi. Part of the reasons why it's not well known is the fact that many of the languages that supposedly belong to this stock were extinct early on, and they weren't very well documented. So comparative studies involving Macro-G are hindered by lack of data, and also by originally a lack of interest, because in Brazil there was this fascination with Tupi languages because they played an important role in the process of colonization of the country. So languages that did not belong to that family, they weren't they didn't attract much attention from the local intellectuals. At the beginning of the colonization, most of the Brazilian coast was occupied by Tupi-speaking tribes. So Tupinambá, a Tupi-Guarani language, was so widespread that the Portuguese chose it to be a lingua franca. And because of that, because it was so important in the first 2 centuries of the colonization, it had an interesting impact in Brazilian Portuguese. And so many people, when they talk about indigenous language in Brazil, they're talking essentially about Tupi. So every time, like when I introduce myself as a guy working with South American languages, Brazilian language, people say, oh, Tupi, right? Well, not necessarily so. The Tupi, they were a recent arrival to the coast of Brazil. And they, in the process of occupying that region, they dislodged many Macro-G speaking tribes. So since the beginning, there was this dichotomy between Tupi and non-Tupi. The non-Tupi were called by the Tupi tapuia, which was a word that can be translated sometimes as the wild ones, the non-Tupi. And then the Portuguese adopted that same point of view. So Tupi and the language was a good language to learn, to be used in missionary work and in the colonization process, but tapuia wasn't that important. They were people to deal with, to get rid of, not people to be understood and studied. So even though tapuia is a very generic term that does not necessarily have anything to do with linguistic affiliation in the beginning, many of those languages, many of those tribes turned out to be Macro-G tribes. And again, as I said, that's why data from that region, especially eastern Brazil, are not very readily available. Many languages died, and all we have of them are maybe 50 lexical items, very poorly collected by missionaries, travelers, natural scientists coming from Europe, and so forth. So that's basically, that's going to be basically an introduction to the Macro-G stock. For those of you who are not very familiar with that yet. I chose that picture of an Ofaye couple, Hei and Hegei, because Ofaye is very symptomatic of the situation involving Macro-G languages and peoples in general. It is a language that was for maybe 3 decades was considered to be extinct. And it's one example in which linguists and anthropologists didn't help the community much. Actually, they did quite the opposite by declaring the language extinct. So when the remnants of the tribe tried to seek official help, they were pointed to these books by very important intellectuals saying that, no, you guys do not exist and your language is no longer spoken. And it was still spoken, and still spoken to this day. I started studying in 2004 on a grant from the ELDP, from the School of Oriental Studies. And back then there were still 12 speakers. Very nicely spread throughout the group ages, from the early 30s all the way to the 80s and 90s. Now they're down to 5, unfortunately. So the language is severely endangered. I was going to talk more about it, but I decided to talk about another endangered language that also has played an important role in linguistic comparison within Macro-G. So topics that we'll be dealing with, that's mostly to guide myself so I don't stray. What is the Macro-G hypothesis? What is the G family, which is the core of the Macro-G stock? What does the reconstruction of Proto-G can contribute to a better understanding of the relationship between G itself and other families such as Carajá and Machacali? The role of poorly documented and endangered languages such as Aricapu. And if there is still time for the topics, could include the likely Macro-G homeland. What do we know so far, and what do we need to still learn in terms of where the original Macro-G speakers came from? And recent developments in the classification of the stock, which with the inclusion of Chiquitano and Jabuti. Chiquitano is spoken all the way in Bolivia, and Jabuti, which is spoken in the heart of Western Amazon in Rondônia. And those are locations that are not very typical for Macro-G languages. So there is some convincing to do, especially among Brazilian intellectuals who tend to believe that Macro-G is this strictly non-Amazonian Brazilian language family. It's not necessarily the case. And on the other hand, Guató, which has been included in the Macro-G stock by all major classifications, should very likely be excluded because there's just no evidence whatsoever for its inclusion. And the fact that it's still being kept in the classification tables is mostly tradition and political reasons as well. Prestige, I would say, from the intellectuals who proposed the inclusion of Guató. Well, the Macro-G stock comprises, as I said, the G family, which is the core, the nucleus of the stock, and a number of possibly related language families, most of which are located in Brazil. The exception being Chiquitano, which is also spoken in Bolivia. I don't have something to point here, but I'll try. So this is the core of the Macro-G stock, which is the G family, which has been established since 1867 by von Martius in the first major classification of Brazilian languages. Then we have, on the eastern part, Iate, Cariri, Camacan, Machacali, Pataxó, Botocudo, Puri. This is Oti, Ofayé, Guató, Ricbatsa, Chiquitano, and Jabuti. That's actually Ricbatsa. This is Bororo, I'm sorry. So you see, it's very widespread, and there is a huge internal diversity in what we consider to be Macro-G. For most of these languages, we can still obtain additional data that suggests that they should indeed be included in the Macro-G stock. But for some of them, we just have no hope of finding any additional data. Yeah?
Can you speak a little bit louder? I don't want to miss a word.
Oh, I'm so sorry. The mic is not helping. Oh, the mic is just for the camera, right? Oh, sorry. Yes, so what part didn't you hear so I can repeat?
I heard it, but it's
okay.
a lot of things.
All right. So, as I said, most languages spoken in eastern Brazil are extinct now. The only exception is Iate, which is basically a very interesting case of linguistic survival there. And people say that religion plays an important role in that, in the sense that all the rituals are performed only by people who speak the language, and in order to feel like you belong to the tribe, you have to take part in those rituals annually. So that helps the language to be preserved, which is an interesting also example on the role of missionary work among tribes in South America, because many linguists were not very concerned about culture. They say, well, they're playing a very important role in documenting all those languages. But sometimes the process of documenting the language itself with the goal of translating the Bible and converting people actually plants the seeds that will lead to the destruction of that culture and consequently of that language. So we have two interesting contrasts here. Cariri was very well documented in colonial times because there is a catechism by a Jesuit missionary, and there is a nice little grammar that he wrote as well. The only cases of non-Macro-G language, non-Tupi language documented during colonial times. But the language is no longer spoken. They are still descendants of the Cariri who still claim ethnic identity. They are still Cariri, but they don't speak their language anymore. While Yate, because of the preservation of this strong cultural tradition, especially the religious tradition, they managed to keep the language. So it's just an interesting parallel there. So all these languages are currently extinct. For some of them, we have fairly good lexical data, but no grammatical data. The worst situation is with the Puri family, for which we have maybe 50 lexical items. Several word lists, but they all tend to repeat the same items. So, for example, a word that we find cognates throughout Macro-G, but we cannot find in this Eastern Brazil, is simply the word for seed. Nobody thought of documenting the word for seed, for example. We have words for God and devil and all the sins that a good Catholic person can think of, but you don't have words for basic items like seed. So it's a documentation that's very uneven. In the case of Puri, one hope is that there are still some documents left in archives, especially in Rio de Janeiro. And one of my goals with my research project is going back to Brazil and researching in the Geographic Institute in Rio, the National Library, the National Museum, to see if I can still find some of this information. There are reports of data being collected, of even a catechism on Puri, in Puri, being made by a priest, and that was supposedly sent to Rio, to the archives in Rio, but nobody was able to locate it so far. Now we come to the western part. Since the beginning of the colonization was, of course, from the east, those tribes were, the first ones with which the Portuguese were in contact. And since most of the languages that were initially added to the Macro-G stock were from the east, there is this idea that most of the diversity within Macro-G is in eastern Brazil. So eastern Brazil would be a good candidate for being the homeland of the Proto-Macro-G speakers. It turns out that that may not be necessarily the case, because this little cluster of language families here, they are very closely related. So they actually might form a subgroup within the stock, while the other ones are very widely, very different. They cannot be subgrouped inside. They are basically at a level, a family level, not a stock level. They are basically isolates, right? So we have more diversity in the West than in the East, especially if we take into consideration the recent inclusion of Chiquitano and of Jabuti. So one likely candidate for the original dispersal of the Macro-G speaking tribes is an area in Brazil that used to be called Mato Grosso, which was, there is still a state called Mato Grosso, but originally in the beginning of Republican times in Brazil, it was a huge area that now was divided into 3 states: Mato Grosso, Rondônia, and Mato Grosso do Sul. That area is where most Macro-G diversity concentrates. There we have Bororo, we have Alfaié, we have Chiquitano, we have Riqubatsa, and for some, Wató, which is not my case. I don't consider Wató being Macro-G. Well, this, I wanted to put them side by side because I wanted to show a list of the languages with the numbers so you could see. But before we move on, I wanted to point out one thing that's very important to mention. Macro-G is not such a close-knit family. I compare it to the situation of Algic in North America, in the sense that you have a very close-knit family, which is like the core of that stock, let me call it this. But then you have this remotely related language that are not, where the correspondences are not so straightforward. So it takes a lot more convincing to do, a lot more work to do in order to prove that those languages are related. And as Goddard had said, you can actually, find evidence of relationship, find some phonological regularities, but it's very unlikely that we will ever be able to reconstruct a full Proto-Macro-G. We can reconstruct Proto-G, and there will be intermediate levels that you can reconstruct, but you hardly can reconstruct Proto-Macro-G. There will be many, many gaps. Not only because of the lack of documentation, but especially because it is a very, very old family. So if Tupi is, as some people estimate, between 5,000 and 6,000 years old, Macro-G would certainly be older than that. So that's at the very threshold of what the comparative method can accomplish. So there are several different classifications. Most of them agree on the basics, but there is some disagreement on the, especially on the outer edges of Macro-J, and we'll see that in a second. So that's going to be hard to read, I'm sorry. But those are 15 families that were historically, by one or other author, suggested as being part of Macro-J. Greenberg was the one that dared the most, as you probably would expect, right? Even based on very, very shaky data and even worse methodology. So he included language that most Brazilian linguists wouldn't include in the Macro-J stock, including Ochi, which is a family, a language from southern Brazil that's now extinct. Chiquitano, which is a language that is now more readily accepted as being Macro-J. And he also included a fictitious language, which is an interesting piece of evidence on his methodological issues, right? If you see Greenberg's classification of Macro-J, there was a language called Kukura that he added to Macro-J. But it turns out that there was never a language called Kukura. The Indian who provided the word list, he was known by Courtney Mondaju, who was a famous Brazilian anthropologist who was very serious about his work, and he knew that guy, and he knew that he spoke some Guarani and maybe some Ofaye, and he mixed a little bit of this and that probably to please an eager scientist. So that went into the records as being the Kukura language, a very short word list, and Greenberg found a way of classifying that into Macro-J. So it's and that's sad because the fact that he also included Chiquitano and Jabuti kind of made people not very ready to accept the inclusion of Chiquitano and Jabuti. Even when later we find additional evidence that shows that, yes, it makes sense to include them into the Macro-J stock. It's the Greenberg effect, we joke in Brazil. The fact that Greenberg said it should be included probably means that no, it should not be included, which is not necessarily the case, because Greenberg not only did original comparative work with very shaky data, and sometimes based on like 3 words he would already classify a language, but he also took advantage of previous literature. So, for example, for the inclusion of Ochi, he is not the first one to suggest that. It was suggested by a German-Brazilian scientist early in the 1900s, and that was published in English, so Greenberg certainly had access to that. Same thing with Jabuti. It was first suggested that it was Macro-J by Courtney Mondaju, and that information was published by Metro in 1942 in English, so it was also available to Greenberg. So that's the reasons, I suppose, that's the reason why he included Jabuti and Chiquitano. But Chiquitano also has a very, the similarities between the prefix system in Chiquitano and the ones in most J and Macro-J languages is very remarkable, very suggestive. So that's one of the cases in which Greenberg actually used real data to suggest a relationship, based probably also on the fact that the literature already said that it was part of Macro-J. According to my own classification, I include J, of course, Camacan, Machacali, Krenak, Puri, Ofaye, Rikbatsa, Bororo, Carajá, Cariri, Jabuti, Yate. I do not include Guató. I include Chiquitano, and I do not include Oti. So that's my version of Macro-J. There are several different versions. Most people who have looked at the data, even people who tend to be a little skeptical, like Lyle Campbell on Chiquitano, for example, he said, yeah, it looks convincing that it is Macro-J. I don't know what he says about Guató, for example. Guató, recently there was a PhD dissertation defended in Brazil trying to prove that Guató was Macro-J. And the results are extremely disappointing. Maybe at most 10 quote-unquote lexical cognates. Each one of them actually is one single attested correspondence. Plus, of course, a reanalysis of the morphology, of the morphological data that don't seem to hold on. So it's there is still a lot to do in terms of coming up with the precise configuration of Macro-J, but in my opinion, that's basically it, except for Guató and Ochi, of course. And of course, except for Kukura, which was a fictitious language, as I mentioned. And the precise relationship between the members of the stock also needs to be worked out. There are certain cases, as I mentioned, that seem to form a subgroup within the stock. So this needs to be worked out. I know, for example, that for sure Machacali and Botocudo, two different families that are geographically close to each other, they should be grouped together within a single subgroup within macro G. So the diversity that at first is so overwhelming, when you start looking at the data, especially when you still have data, you see that's not as bad, at least for some of the cases. But as you see, it's very widespread geographically. It seems to be very old, so the fact that it's so diverse is not surprising. The G family, my project here is basically a reconstruction of Proto-G, which is the ancestor of about a dozen languages spoken in Brazil. And based on that reconstruction, I will try to find additional cognates to demonstrate whether certain languages should be included or not. So I'll advance some of those results today, but let's stick with the G family for a while. So as I said, the existence of G as a family has been recognized since early classifications by Marcius, 1867. Let me show you his map. That's Marcius' map. That was the first linguistic map of lowland South America, of Brazil, basically. And all this huge yellow area in the middle, that's still basically what we consider to be the territory of the G languages today. He also proposed some more remote relationship with languages that he called Crem, which are also, to this day, included in the macro G stock. So the history itself kind of shows how closely or remotely related the languages are. Carajá, for example, which is the language I'm most familiar with, I wrote a grammar of it for my dissertation, was one of the last languages to be included in the macro G stock. I myself, when I started studying Carajá, I did not believe that it was macro G, but now I'm completely convinced that it is macro G. So sometimes if you look at the history of inclusion or exclusion of families, you see how closely related they are or not. But not necessarily the case, because, for instance, Chiquitano is much more obviously related to G than Carajá is. But Carajá is right in the middle of G territory, so people are more ready to accept that they are a macro G tribe. And also, of course, then there is cultural aspects that are taken into consideration. Like Bororo is, according, in my opinion, macro G, but not as obviously macro G as, say, Chiquitano or Jabuti, which are way out of the traditional macro G territory. Right? But because there's so much literature showing deep cultural similarities between Bororo and G by anthropologists from here, from the Harvard Project and all that, the circular villages, the social organization and all that, people are more ready to accept that Bororo is macro G, even though the linguistic data is not as strong as, say, Jabuti or Chiquitano. So when I'm talking to Brazilian anthropologists and I say, well, yeah, Chiquitano and Jabuti are macro G, I say, oh, really? I can't believe it, really? I mean, they have nothing to do with each other. Well, as we know, language tends to be more conservative than culture, so cultures change very quickly when compared to languages, and cultural similarities are not necessarily a good indication of linguistic affinity. So that's Marcius' map. So as you see, there's no G or macro G language to the west of Brazil, according to Marcius' classification, right? That would start changing when finally people started exploring the Amazon. Rondônia, for example, was fairly unknown back then, and they started discovering languages that were likely macro G in those areas. Back then, it was still called, the most common word used to refer to this stock was tapuia, the same word that the Tupi used to refer to the entire non-Tupi speaking population. Okay. If you see the literature, in general, G is divided into three main branches. Let me make this big. Southern G, Northern G, and Central G. I prefer to group it slightly differently. Of course, there is a southern branch, a central branch, and a northern G branch. But these two branches, they are much more closely related than when compared to Southern G. That's the reason why Southern G, Caingang mostly, was one of the last languages to be included in the G family. Some people thought they were related, but not at the family level, so they kept Kaingangi out. One good example is Kurt Nimwendaju. In the beginning of his writings, he didn't believe Kaingang was G, but towards the end of his life, he was already convinced, and that's a map that he drew in 1936, I think. And it shows already that the basic current configuration of the G family, with one remarkable exception. If you look at this little island here, it's not very visible, I'm sorry, but you see there's a little red dot here, right? That's where the Jabuti languages are spoken. Nimwendaju in 1934 was already convinced that Jabuti should be included in the Macro-J stock. And that for a guy who was in general very careful to not make fast generalizations, that's a good sign that there was something in that. But it still took decades for us to have enough data and to test that hypothesis and confirm that hypothesis. Any questions so far? Yes.
Yeah, I have one question. As Rick van Geijn, who worked on Yuracare, which is a language isolate of Bolivia, somewhere north of Chiquitano, told me once that maybe Yuracare is also Macro-J. What do you think of that?
I have to look at the data. One thing that Chiquitano is interesting because it was used as a lingua franca in that mission area, right?
Right.
And it will have lots of loans from other languages as well. So there will be similarities between Chiquitano and other languages that are not due to common inheritance, but to contact. So there are words there that are clearly Guarani, for example, especially the ones that refer to white culture, amazingly enough, right? Because Guarani was the language of the missions, the Jesuit missions in Paraguay and also in Brazil. So you have like all this mixture within Chiquitano. What's interesting is that when you look at a deeper level, like morphology, especially the morphology that's closer to the root, you see that that's so clearly Macro-J that it's fascinating, that it's so far away from the other Macro-J speaking tribes. But I need to look at the data. Would it be part of the Bororo family, maybe?
Well, Yuracare is spoken not sort of more in north of Chiquitano, as far as I can remember. Mm-hmm. Not anywhere close, not really close to Chiquitano. Mm-hmm. So I don't know anything about Yuracare. I just know this. He said he did most of the field work on Yuracare. He said that maybe it's Macro-J, maybe that's something that Willem Adelaar told him. I don't know.
Oh, nice.
I mean,
yeah, it's something to look into. Yeah, but
so I have a question.
Sure.
In your map, where you show the J, Macro-J, likely candidates, maybe I missed it, but are there other languages that are spoken in the
yes. Yes, yes. The thing is, that's another very interesting thing, that most G tribes, they weren't in contact with each other for at least for 500 years, at least since the Portuguese arrived. They were not in contact with each other.
So they were split.
Yeah, so sometimes like you find things that are not necessarily indication of genetic relationship, but the fact that they're so apart from each other, it's a strong indication that it is. Like, for example, before I move on, one metaphor that's very common in Macro-J languages is the hearing as knowing metaphor. It's very common. So the root that we can reconstruct for to hear in Proto-J is the same root that means to know. And that turns out to be the same thing with cognates in Jabuti, for example. The same root means to know and to hear. And that's very, very common among Macro-J languages and not necessarily very common among lowland South American languages in general. I only found another instance in which this was studied, and it was in Australia, where the conclusion was that it was due to contact. But considering the fact that, say, Jabuti is all the way in western Brazil, close to the Bolivian border, and J is all the way in central Brazil, closer to eastern Brazil than any other family, suggests that it's not due to language contact. It's something that was probably inherited. The fact that this polysemy, hearing and knowing, it's preserved it can be reconstructed for both Proto-J and Proto-Jabuti, strongly suggests that it was already a feature of Proto-Macro-J. So that yeah, sorry.
It's interesting to know and to understand, because Welsh or Arabic language uses hearing in terms of understanding, but knowing is something else.
It's all words related to thinking are centered around the ear in Macro-G in general. Like Carajá doesn't use a cognate word for hearing. But again, thinking and hearing in Carajá is the same thing. And everything related to cognitive processes or, you know, to fainting, to waking up, to learning something has to do with the ear. All the metaphors are, like now incorporation, many times the word for ear is incorporated into verbs of cognition, for example. So it's fascinating that it's so common in Macro-G, even among languages that are not, you know, closely situated geographically.
Just
right?
following up on what you're saying, I have the languages I work with, it's slightly different in that hearing and knowing, or hearing and understanding, are different. But if you want to say, I don't understand, you say, I don't hear.
Ah.
I didn't hear it.
Yeah.
Right, but it has to be in the negative, it can't be in the positive.
Not to go too far afield, but there's a lot of, you know, elements of cognition tied up with the gut and the intestines.
Mm-hmm.
To remember someone is to keep them in your gut. To forget them is to throw them out of your gut. To plan something is to turn something in your gut. A lot of things that they really have.
Yeah, that's very interesting, I think, because that's not the kind of thing you think as being very stable diachronically. But in Macro-G, it seems to be very stable diachronically because, like I said, this whole polysemy can be reconstructed for, you know, all the beginning of Macro-G. So it's been around for a while, and it's still very relevant in all these cultures. Anthony Seeger, who works with Suya, right? He wrote a paper about that, how important it is hearing. And you see that it has lots of ethnographic correlates, like, for example, the fact that piercing your ear is actually opening your mind. You know, it's a sign of maturity because it opens your mind. Among the Carajá, there are some hunting taboos and eating taboos that are also related to this. So you're not supposed to give tapir meat to a kid because the kid is still growing up, and tapirs are supposed to be deaf, therefore stupid. So if you give tapir meat to a little kid, it might make it not a very good asuntador, a very good understander of things. On the other hand, turtles are supposed to have very good hearing. I don't know how scientific that is. But for example, there is a little bone that is located in the ear of the turtle, and that is used to pierce the ear of a little boy, for example. So it's interesting how linguistic data are correlated with all this ethnographic information. Why is it important to subdivide the G linguistic family? Well, from the comparative point of view, from the reconstruction point of view, if you find a cognate only in central and northern G, it's not necessarily reconstructible for the entire G family, right? But if you find a cognate in northern G and in southern G, so you will easily reconstruct it for the entire family. I mentioned that because the first reconstruction of Proto-G by Irvine Davis didn't take that into consideration. So many of his reconstructed forms are attested only for one branch of the family, or only for the two branches that I'm grouping under the label Amazonian G. So that has had to be revised as well. So the goals of my reconstruction, as I think of most of any linguistic reconstruction, is to detect general patterns of sound change, like cluster elimination, vowel shifts, process of lenition, etc., and morphological change, adoption of new paradigms, fossilization of old ones, etc. Paying special attention to the existence of competing stem forms containing semi-fossilized morphology, which is very common in many Macro-G languages. Identify morphemes correctly so as to prevent comparing apples with oranges. I'll get back to this example later. Discard pseudocognates, which also happens a lot in Davis's reconstruction, and identify additional cognates even when they look nothing like each other, right? Like, for example, the words for to suckle in Portuguese, or suck in Portuguese, I'm sorry, in Caingang and Carajá, they are cognates, but they look nothing like each other. But fa, right, in Caingang. Fa in Caingang corresponds very regularly to Carajá, and a in Caingang corresponds very regularly to Carajá, o, as evidenced by additional data. So one thing with the reconstruction by Davis and also by many other SIL linguists working in South America is that the obvious superficial similarity was always the main criterion, and sometimes that led to some very bad mistakes. One example that I mentioned there, the word reconstructed by Davis for nose in Proto-G was Nhinhacré. But when you look at the data and you take into consideration Southern G, for example, where you only have the 2 initial syllables, you realize that this word meant originally nostril. So cré can be reconstructed as a word for hole, right? If you try to compare the entire thing with data from other languages, you're going to have problems. So, for example, when Sarah Guczynski, an SIL linguist, compared Offayer with Davis's Proto-G, she actually eliminated from the comparison the 2 initial syllables and only compared the last syllable. Again, superficial phonological similarity being taken into consideration more than regularity of systematic regularity. So this is just an example of the kind of problem we run into when we look at previous classifications of Macro-G languages. Another problem with Guczynski is that she failed to keep loanwords aside. So many of her reconstructed Proto-G / Offayer words include loanwords, including Portuguese loanwords, which were not there, I don't know, 5,000 years ago, right? So far, the comparison managed to double the number of reconstructed forms. Well, it doesn't look like that much because Davis reconstructed 112 forms. But considering that many of those forms have to be discarded, some of them have to be refined, it is a nice little accomplishment, and towards the end of the project, hopefully I'll have much more than that. So just some of the problems that Davis's reconstruction presented and that we had to deal with and to address. One of the problems is that, well, he made some very lasting contributions. You know, I think he really should always be very well respected in the annals of G linguistics. But the data he had to rely upon back then weren't exactly very good. There weren't thorough descriptions of the morphology of any Macro-G language or any G language back then. So many of the words that he used were morphologically complex, but he couldn't realize that because they weren't morphologically analyzed. The main problem, I think, is that he failed to separate, to point out that Southern G is not at the same comparative level as Northern G and Central G, because Northern G and Central G are, as I said, more closely related. And then you compare both of them with Southern G. And that leads to an overestimation of cognates, right? Some of them are restricted to Northern G. So how can you reconstruct something for a proto-language if you can only find it in one of the branches of the family? So that's 5%. Many, around 30%, are restricted to Amazonian G. Because they are so much more closely related, it's much easier to find cognates, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that it traces all the way back to Proto-G. Well, as I said, this has obvious implications for Macro-G studies, since a format tested only for a branch of the family may very well be an innovation, right? But eventually, many of the data that he proposed as being reconstructible for Proto-G turned out to be reconstructed for Proto-G once you look throughout the lexicon and you find additional cognates. Now we have dictionaries of many G and Macro-G language. That makes our work much easier. So again, my criticism of Davis is not against Davis, it's against the situations that he had to deal with back then. If he had the dictionaries and the resources we have nowadays, I'm sure he would have done a much better job, of course. Problem number 2, there are many mixed reconstructions, like words that happen to be similar but are not cognates. He included them as similar. That's a problem with isolating monosyllabic languages like the Macro-G language, right? There will be a high chance of similarities that are due to accidents. So within Davis's reconstruction, there are words that are slightly similar semantically and slightly similar phonologically, but they're not cognates, and a pair like red and amber, or amber, I'm sorry, this should be a ni, and ash, or burn and bake, wing and feather, one and only. You know, I didn't add the data just so we don't have, it doesn't become so burdensome for somebody who's not that interested into the details of G and macro G. Problem number 3 is the lack of morphological information. Like I said, many of the data that he had to rely upon weren't morphologically analyzed. So many times you have some correspondences that you're comparing a word in one language that's inflected, let's say, for third person, with a word in another language that's inflected for second person, let's say. So in the end, you're going to have all these attestations, several different correspondences involving one single consonant in the proto-language. So for what I was able to reconstruct, for example, in those forms that were reconstructed by Davis, was what in South America people are used to call relational prefixes, which are basically linking consonants between a noun and its possessor, or a verb and its object, and so forth. And that alternates with a third-person prefix in the proto-language and in most current languages as well. So if you are comparing a third-person form from one language with one that has only the linking morpheme in another, you're going to come up with wrong correspondences as well. So again, morphology always helps a lot when you finally have access to that. There are lots of fossilized morphemes whose meaning is not clear at this moment, and probably it was already a little confused back in the proto-language time. They are fossilized, but not quite, because you can find forms with one of those prefixes in one language and forms with a different prefix in another language. So they are fossilized currently, but maybe they weren't fossilized yet in Proto-G. But their semantics is hard to determine. They are like, I think a colleague, an Argentinian linguist who worked on Northern G languages, he said it's like the Germanic type of prefixes, you know, that they can indicate so many different things, you know. In G, you see them having some classificatory value, some valence indicating value, and so forth. So a comparison between my reconstruction and Davis's reconstruction. You see, his words tend to be a little longer because they were morphologically complex. So the word for mouth actually includes a word for mouth proper and a root for cavity. So instead of reconstructing as a two-syllable word, I reconstruct as yar. I always indicate the so-called relational prefix or linking consonant with the word for diplomatic reasons, because in Brazil there is a debate on whether these consonants are part of the stem or not. For me, it's not that relevant from the historical point of view, because I'm trying to prove whether these processes are related or not necessarily if it's prefixation or consonant dropping or something like that. You have the exact same process happening all over macro G, so it's probably reconstructible for the proto-language. Now, whether it was historically a prefix or just part of the stem, that's something that we can decide later. So I try to not alienate any of my macro G or G colleagues by segmenting that. And also because many languages will have those prefixes as fossilized forms. So just to know that you're comparing a consonant, that it's somehow changeable, mobile, it's nice to keep the reconstructed form with the changing consonant there, the so-called relational prefix, linking consonant or whatever. The word for nose I had already mentioned, but the word for fire is interesting. When Davis reconstructed his Proto-G, he finishes his article with something that I consider kind of prophetic. He says, well, there are still many, that was 1966, so he said there are still many uncontacted tribes in central Brazil. And it could be that some of them are G-speaking tribes. It turns out that yes, years later, a tribe called Panará was located, and they are speakers of a Northern G language, the most divergent Northern G language. They were considered to be extinct for 100 years. They were actually from southern Brazil, central and southern Brazil, and then when people started exploring that part of the Amazon in the 1960s, they found this tribe that turned out to be historical descendants of a tribe that lived closer to São Paulo, which is fascinating to think of the survival of this tribe. And it turns out to be one of the most conservative languages within the G family. So this ku in kuzu, which is the form he reconstructed for Proto-G for fire, it's obviously a prefix. Panará doesn't have that prefix, so it allows us to reconstruct for Proto-G a monosyllabic root for fire. And when you look into other families, you see that that's true as well. This piece of information is interesting because one of the languages that we have less evidence for relationship with Macro-G is Cariri. It's an extinct language that was, as I said, documented by Jesuit missionary. We don't have much lexical cognates, but there are some very peculiar morphological categories that are common to both families. So it's interesting that the word for fire, it's a monosyllabic word in Cariri, but it cannot be possessed directly. You have to use a prefix indicating indirect possession. That's very common in lowland South America, right? You cannot possess water, you cannot possess land. You have to say, my thing, the land, my thing, the water. That's very common also in G. And the morpheme that indicates that in G, it's also found in Machacali, in Cariri, in Krenak, and so forth, in several different families. So it's a nice little piece of morphological evidence for their relationship. But you see, the way the construction, the way the expression is constructed in both families is identical. You cannot possess it directly, so you need the indirect possessive marker, and then a marker of third person. The same segmentation and all that. For languages that are thousands of miles apart, and that are very hard to prove their relationship, that's, I think, a neat little indicator of some deep genetic connection there. And then there was just some wrong reconstructions. Maybe he was kind of in a hurry because Davis wasn't a South Americanist. He was, I don't know how the SIL linguists would consider him, but he was a traveling teacher, right? You know, sometimes they sent more experienced North American colleagues to South America to teach them things like historical linguistics and so forth. That's why Sara Guczynski was there. She was there to help plant SIL in Brazil with, by invitation of the Brazilian federal government. So she taught classes there, and she helped her SIL friends also with training and all that. And she was told by Darcy Ribeiro, the guy with whom I share the last name, a famous Brazilian anthropologist. She was told by him to go document Alfayet because it was down to its last speakers. That's what Darcy thought. So she went there, she documented, she interviewed those two last speakers that she thought were the last speakers of the language, and then she published a paper saying fragments of an extinct language. And Darcy Ribeiro didn't help much either because, you know, in his memoirs, already in the 1990s, he's like, thanks to me telling Guczynski to go save Alfayet, the language is now saved for the researchers. And I put myself in the position of an Alfayet guy reading that in a village, and I said, really? Good job, Darcy. So there are like just plain wrong reconstructions. Like there are words that are reconstructed as being homophonous in the proto-language, and they are not homophonous in several of the current languages. The thing is, again, he took into consideration mostly data from Apinagé, which was then one of the best described G languages. And Apinagé is very conservative in some aspects, but not all of them. So Apinagé merged Proto-G, where is Apinagé? Yeah, and Proto-G Pa. But most languages didn't merge them. So he reconstructed based on Apinagé, but it turns out that many of his homophonous words were not homophonous. So if you look at his 112 reconstructions, there's not one single instance of W initial morphemes. It's because Apinagé, which is the language that he looked at more closely, doesn't have a W in initial position. Oh yeah, and that's just to say that then we find an explanation when we reconstruct W for Proto-G. We find an explanation for the fact that there is one language where there is a three-way contrast between W, B, and P. In general, in G and Macro-G languages, you don't have that. I'm sorry. Yes, no, I'm sorry. W, B, and P. So Kayapó is the only language where you have a phonemic B. B and M in G and Macro-G in general, they are not contrasting phonemes. B will be pronounced as fully oral before oral vowels, or semi-oral, like mba, like in Apinagé, for example, and fully nasal before nasal vowels. But because Proto-G W turned into B in Kayapó, so Kayapó developed a contrast between B and B purely. So we start finding explanations for apparent aberrations within a single language within the family. So what's new, besides increasing the number of reconstructed forms? We start detecting general patterns of phonological change. I mean, Davis pointed like very individual, right, processes. Well, this corresponds to this, but there are general processes of simplification or complexification that you can detect now. One of them is the fact that in Southern G, clusters were systematically simplified. In Central G, there was a systematic process of Esperantization before high vowels. Like I mentioned, W and P got merged in a Pinagé, which is very conservative in terms of the behavior of its vowels, but not that conservative when it comes to consonants. And there's pervasive process of vowel shift in both Central G and Southern G. And it's interesting because they went opposite directions. So you had raising in Central G and you had lowering in Southern G. So in Central G, what was E in the proto-language became E, what was E became E, and what was E remained as E. But you still can, of course, distinguish old E's from recent E's, because that same process of Esperantization before high vowels does not apply to recent E's, only to old E's. And the same happened to back vowels. Not as much as it happened to the front vowels. So A remains as A, but O became U, and U remained as U. So it's a almost complete vowel shift in Central G. Also an almost complete process of vowel shift involving back vowels in Southern G. So what was A became A, what was O became A, and what was U became O. And Kaingang is still going on. So what became A in Proto-Southern G, now it's A in Kaingang. So what became O is now A, and so forth. So it's one of those, how did Sapir call that? Like, is it a drift? Did I understand the concept of drift correctly? But it's like, the process was accomplished in Proto-Southern G, but Kaingang kept on doing it, you know? Those are the data, if you want to take a look at it more later. How much time do we have? 5 minutes? Okay, guys. So, of course, there are new developments in morphology. I reconstructed derivational suffixes, inflectional prefixes, and that's the rule in most Macro-G languages. You don't have much morphology, but what you have seems to be inherited. So the little morphology we have nowadays is inherited all the way from Proto-Macro-G. Of course, some languages develop more complex morphologies. Karajá has gigantic words, because it has now incorporation. Everything is marked within the verb. Direction, whether it is centripetal or centrifugal, is marked within the verb. But those are all innovations. And Panará, again, going back to that language that was located 100 years after it was considered to be extinct, is also an interesting case in which you see polysynthesis being made. You like polysynthesis in the making, right? Because most Northern G languages are very isolating, but Panará incorporates postpositions, incorporates classifiers, incorporates subjects and objects, and it's become increasingly morphologically complex when compared to very isolating Northern G language. So it's an interesting case study for historical linguistics, because you have a very close-knit family where it's much easier to find cognates, so you can get your comparative groove on, can I say that? But then you have this a little more frustrating relationships that are not so obvious, but nonetheless fascinating as well. Now, to the lack of information, we can reconstruct a lot of things, but we cannot so far reconstruct any word referring to large South American mammals in Proto-G. So, of course, the tapir is all over South America, in both Northern G, Central G, Northern, Central G, and Southern G territory, but you don't have a common word inherited from the proto-language for tapir, or for capivara, or for paca, or even for armadillo, The same thing with the larger birds, like the rhea. You can reconstruct it for Proto-Amazonian G, but not for the entire Proto-G. And now I started suspecting that even that could be onomatopoeic, so But you can reconstruct, things for those little animals that are our faithful companions throughout our history as human beings. Lice, ticks, and flies. You can reconstruct that for protégé. So why? Is it hunting taboos? Is it because of their migrations? They might have gone through territories where those animals weren't available for a while, and then when they finally got to territories where they were available, they adopted a new word. Those are all speculations that I've been thinking about. I don't have a good explanation for it yet. Also for cultural aspects, of course you can reconstruct very few terms of kinship terms, mother, father, aunt, that's basically it. You can't, there's no evidence that they had already agriculture in protégé times. There's nothing you can reconstruct referring to protégé agriculture. You can reconstruct for an intermediate stage, Proto-Amazonian G, like the word for garden, for example. But still, nothing massive like in Proto-Tupi, for example, where you can find clear evidence of ceramics, of agriculture already 5,000, 6,000 years ago. That cannot be found in G. So agriculture is not as recent as people used to think, because the idea was that G, same idea that the Tupi kind of taught the Portuguese, right? That the G were primitive, they didn't cultivate gardens, they didn't have ceramics. It turns out that archaeology is showing it differently. Ceramics they certainly had before the arrival of the Tupi, and way before the arrival of the Portuguese. They had some sort of agriculture, maybe not as well developed. Maybe they didn't rely so much on agriculture as Tupi tribes, but they had some sort of it, including plants. One plant specifically that they domesticated themselves, because currently is only used by G-speaking tribes, so it was probably domesticated no more than 2,000 years ago. So one of the ideas with the future of my comparative project is to trace the distribution of this plant throughout Brazil, in each of the G tribes where they're still cultivating it, and see if we can pinpoint the original place of domestication, because that will give us a clue on where the Proto-G speakers were maybe 2,000 years ago, right? It's called Cupa in their language. I think the scientific name is Cissus gongeloides or something like that. It's a creeper. So it has like, how to say, the stems are very thin in the wild variety. But the domesticated one is thick, and it is used the same way as manioc is used. So you boil it, you make flour out of it. And it's a plant that likes dry environments, so it suggests that it was originally domesticated in the Brazilian savanna, or even drier areas like the so-called caatinga in the Brazilian northeast. So there are lots of fascinating possibilities. They preserve the original, the word is common to all the languages, so it was likely present in Proto-G. It's found all the way from Maranhão, which is eastern Brazil, to Mato Grosso, which is western Brazil. So you have this huge arch of G migration, and they all carry the plant along. So that's another fascinating possibility that can be explored in the future. So I'm sorry. And this is like, I did a lot of trimming of this presentation, because I realized that if I tried to shove too much detail into this, it wouldn't work out, but still. So I was going to show two examples of cases in which an improved reconstruction of Proto-G helps us not only find additional cognates in other families, but also to solve synchronic issues in those families. So I have no time anymore, right? Okay, so this is a topic for next time.